Greetings, friends and fellow freelancers. Welcome back to another episode of Tabletop Mercenary. This week I want to talk about the often overlooked tool that exists for those of us trying to make a living in the TTRPG space, which is community creation platforms. For those who haven't come across them before, community creation platforms include things like Scleracian Vault, Pathfinder Infinite, DM's Guild, as well as Storyteller's Vault. In short, these are agreements that have been formed by companies that hold intellectual properties for certain gaming settings or certain gaming rule sets, and they allow creators who are not part of that company to use these things in pre-agreed ways. And this gives a lot of us the opportunity to take what would otherwise be fan projects, where we would have to make significant changes to them in order to file off the serial numbers and make it something unique, and just put it up for sale without changing too many of the things or giving it a new paint job. And there are pros and cons to these tools, but a lot of us aren't even aware they exist, or if we are aware they exist, we don't really know why we should check them out. So I thought this week I would cover the pros and cons of these various programs, since I've used at least a few of them thus far in my career, and I've had good results and I've had bad results, and I've learned a couple of things along the way. So, without further ado, let's get into the pros of community creation platforms. For a lot of designers out there, community creation platforms seem like an answer to your prayers. Whether it's because you really need a particular city or species from the Forgotten Realms to make your module work, or because you really loved the World of Darkness and you wanted to contribute to that canon setting, you didn't want to have to try and come up with a way to reinvent the ideas that you had just to put them out for the public. And that is one of the honestly major advantages that you get with using these platforms, is that because we're already familiar with a particular setting, we're already familiar with a particular game structure or game setup, we don't have to build everything from scratch, and we don't have to be constantly filing off the serial numbers to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to get us sued. The ability to just exist and create within an already established setting saves you so much time and energy and work. But more than that, it means that, particularly for people who are newer to the industry, people who are not as familiar with the process, and who haven't gotten a lot of projects under their belt, it allows you to operate in a very narrow way without getting overwhelmed. And that can be very, very, very useful, particularly if you are starting out, or if, like myself in many cases, you've been putting in a lot of brain juice in other products, and you don't have a whole lot of leftover time and energy to take on something really big and really heavy right there. And that can be very useful. Another useful thing about these particular projects is that they come with a built-in audience. That built-in audience may vary in size depending on popularity of game at any given time, depending on popularity of setting at any time. Because, for example, Pathfinder Infinite allows you to make things in the Golarion setting to take the intellectual properties of things that Paizo has created that you want to use. That means that whether you want to set something in the nation of Taldor, if you want to set something with a canon organization like the Hell Knights, you can do that in a Pathfinder Infinite project. You don't need to use that particular platform if you're just using the Pathfinder rule set to make something of your own. As a good example, lots of my stuff for my Sundara Dawn of a New Age setting, it uses Pathfinder 1st Edition rules. It uses none of Paizo's intellectual property. All of that stuff was made by myself. So I don't need to put that on Pathfinder Infinite, but for projects that I have done, such as 100 books to find across the Inner Sea, that I did need them for, because that is set explicitly within their world, and it's appealing to people who are playing in that world, whether it's people who are running their own home games using Golarion as a world, or if it's people who are running adventure paths or modules that are set within Golarion and the game master wants a little extra flair. That's the major difference here, and that is also a thing to consider for yourself of which audience are you trying to appeal to, and how in-depth into the intellectual property are you going to have to get in order to make your project a reality. So lastly, what makes these particularly useful is they don't require extra licensing fees specifically. We'll get into more details in the cons section, but typically the way things work when you are a designer and you want to use a game system, a setting, etc., that doesn't have an already established free use like you have with the OGL or various other things to say you can use this system openly, you can use this setting openly, whatever it is that's covered in that license, you have to then pay for a license in order to be allowed to create things with it. I believe Call of Cthulhu has this for those who want to design things for that setting, for that system. You need to pay the fee before you even get to work on the project to release it. Theoretically, you could finish the project and then purchase the license agreement, but that's getting into the weeds. In short, if the thing you're making requires a license payment, you have to pay before you release the product, otherwise that gets into territory where you could be sued. These platforms do not require that kind of fee. So if you are figuring out, what's your art budget, what's your time budget, what are you going to pay your various freelancers, you don't have to have a separate section on your line items for this is how much it's going to cost us just to release it. And that can also be very useful because a lot of the time designers do not have that extra money in our shoestring to make something in a given setting or with a given system. It's honestly one of the major reasons I haven't worked in certain systems is I like the idea of certain projects. I like the idea of releasing books or products or stories for certain game lines, but I just don't have that extra money up front for something that I have no idea if it's going to do well or not. So this gives you a little more freedom to make that gamble. And all of those are very useful. Perhaps one of the most useful things, and this is particularly for independent designers out there, is that community creation platforms also offer you resources in order to clean up and make your stuff look as pretty as possible. For folks who have not seen any of the stuff I've done for the World of Darkness, for Changeling the Lost in particular, for Geist, for Mage, any of those things, you will notice that it has a lot of the quote-unquote official art from, the World of Darkness, the Chronicles of Darkness setting. And the reason for that is not because my publisher cribbed it and hoped nobody would notice. It's because when you make something using these platforms, they give you access to lots of resources, to lots of assets that you normally wouldn't have access to. So this allows you to get lots of art for no additional cost. It allows you to get layouts and color schemes and various other things to really make your product jive with the rest of the canon. So if you're releasing something for Vampire, or if you're releasing something for Geist, or if you're releasing something for Pathfinder, it allows you to sort of blend in and have the same feel as that product, even though you are not working for the company that owns the intellectual property. You are not an official part of either Paizo or Onyx Path or any of these other companies, but you have the same look and the same feel, which could be really expensive to duplicate on your own. It's that equivalent of, you could get a Big Mac for $5, or you could spend $300 attempting to recreate it at home in your kitchen using your own ingredients. And that can also have a very large appeal to lots of folks who want those resources and assets to make their products look really good, but they don't have room or space in the budget to buy extra art, to commission extra things, or to even use existing art that they think would be perfect, but it's behind a wall for intellectual property for a certain company. So those are things to keep in mind. It's a little bit rambly, it's a bit of a long list, but there are lots of good reasons to use these community use platforms. With that said, though, they are not perfect, and there are some things you need to keep in mind before you decide to go all in on making stuff, either exclusively or majority, for these platforms. We'll get into those in a moment. And now we come to the other side of the coin. Because while there are advantages, there are great reasons to use these platforms. I don't want anyone going in with their eyes closed and hoping for the best. There are things you have to keep in mind, and that might make certain projects more or less feasible. First and foremost, you have to follow the rules of these platforms. And while they will vary and there will be fine print that you have to read, all of them have a couple of basics. First and foremost, you usually have to respect the canon of the setting. So I couldn't, for example, make a Pathfinder Infinite project that kills a bunch of major characters that have been established throughout the setting and replaces them with my own self-inserts or my own NPCs. Enjoyable as that might be, that's not a thing you'd be allowed to do. Similar for World of Darkness, you can't rewrite major historical events that already exist in the canon and change them to something else. You can't alter the fundamental nature of how certain monsters work. You could offer alternative builds, you could offer offshoots or changes or make additions, but you can't go back and change things that are a canon part of the setting. That would require you to have the go-ahead of the company and usually to be employed by them. That's changing the intellectual property in a big way, and that's out of bounds. Another thing you're often not allowed to do is you cannot just grab the mechanics of a game if it doesn't explicitly allow you to do this and make your own game with them. As an example, I cannot just grab the storyteller system and make my own addition to the Chronicles of Darkness. I could not, for example, make the game Slasher a game of Bloody Legends, though if folks want to hear more about that, or if you happen to work at Onyx Path and you're intrigued by this project, get a hold of me. I can make a pitch for you. But these are limitations. They allow you to work within the bounds of existing canon, with existing rules, with existing setups, and you can make additions and make a couple of tweaks and changes and fun things. But you cannot go in and just run wild over the established setting as it is. That's something very important to keep in mind, particularly because a lot of people, when they want to make something for an existing setting or an existing property, one of the major things that we often take offense with as designers is we see a thing and we don't like the way it's designed, or we think we have a better idea or a better take, and we want to make that alteration. So it's important to keep in mind that your alteration might not be allowed. Read the rules carefully to see what you can and cannot do. Beyond that, however, now we get into slightly more practical considerations. Let's say that you have a project which is completely allowed by the rules, it doesn't mess with the canon, it should be perfectly fine to release on one of these platforms. Before you get to work on it, ask yourself how big your sales numbers have to be for this to really work. Ask yourself how big the audience has to be before you embark on this project. As an example, I have done a lot of stuff with Storyteller's Vault throughout my time making stuff for that particular platform. I've worked in several different games for both the World and Chronicles of Darkness. I've done stuff for Werewolf the Apocalypse, I've done stuff for both versions of Vampire, I've done stuff for Changeling the Lost, Geist the Sin Eaters, and Mage of the Awakening, as well as one or two splats that are just general use for any World of Darkness game. If I were to get a project where they said, hey, this needs to move at least 50 copies, at least 100 copies, I could feasibly do that with a Changeling release if I made it interesting enough. Something I probably couldn't do it with is a Vampire release, because despite being the biggest game with the most popularity, Vampire has the smallest audience in my experience when it comes to independently created content. If it came out from the company itself, if it had an official stamp of approval, if it had a lot of people bigging it up or making the signal larger, absolutely it could move copies. But when you have the bigger projects, the bigger settings, there's more competition for them, and that audience size hasn't changed. So keep in mind both how big the audience is that you're playing to, as well as how many other people are making things for a particular game, because that can lead you to change your expectations. Additionally, because these are often very game or setting specific when it comes to community creation platforms, you're appealing to a very specific audience. For example, if I make things for Golarion using Pathfinder Infinite, that may not appeal to people who are doing a homebrew setting. It may not appeal to people who wanted stuff for my Sundara setting. You may have people who want something for the Forgotten Realms or for whatever other fantasy setting they're using. And you're kind of excluding those folks. It's not impossible that they'll pick it up. They might think it's neat enough that they'll port it over to their own world. But you are, for the built-in audience, you also have the built-in not audience, if you want to think of it that way. So big fish, small pond in a lot of settings. You also need to keep in mind that in addition to a limited audience, though it is ready and willing for you, you also have extra costs that come with these. and I know I mentioned in the last section these did not require a licensing fee before you release things. That is technically true. However, that is not to say that you get away scot-free. Because for all of the products that come with this particular platform, there's a caveat included that the holder of the intellectual property, whatever company it is that is at the other end of this platform, gets a fee whenever you make a sale. So if you made something for any of the platforms I mentioned, or any of the ones that I haven't that function under this agreement, there's usually an additional percentage cost of every sale that goes to them. So you have to ask yourself, are you going to make enough sales to make up for that cut you have to give to the intellectual property holder? Are you going to be able to make sales if you raise the cost enough to cover what you owe them? Or is that going to be something that really stops this product from flying? And I can tell you from experience that not being able to add an extra dollar to something, or not being able to add a couple extra percentage points for yourself, it may not sound like much, but it is often the difference between something getting the go-ahead and being a good investment of your time and your energy, and being something that really isn't worth it when you could make more just designing something for your own system, your own game, or that's just setting and rules neutral that people can pick up for whatever they want. And I do not want anyone to think that these are exclusionary by any means. These are just the realistic costs of doing business when it comes to using these platforms in order to put out RPG products. And it is definitely something that can work. I have done it. I would very much like to do more of it in the future, but it is often a game of numbers, costs, and energy, of how much can you put into it and how much do you expect to get out of it. So keep that in mind if you're planning on using one of these, and before you even get started on anything, make sure that you read the fine print and that you understand it. If you come to a section that doesn't make sense to you, or if you're very confused, don't hope that it will just work out okay in the end. That can get you into a lot of legal entanglements. It probably won't be a huge deal, but it can at the very least result in you having to take down something that you put a lot of time and effort and energy into because you didn't follow, section A subclause B as to how it needed to be presented. Now, that's all I have on this topic for this week. If you have questions about community creation platforms, if there's something I didn't answer that you need more information on, please leave it in the comments down below. And if you have another topic for making a living as a TTRPG creator, if you have more questions about the space, or if you have questions about something that I've had experience with, or if you just want to hear more about that game pitch I mentioned, reach out to me and let me know. And till next time, this is your Tabletop Mercenary, signing off. First and foremost, thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Tabletop Mercenary. If there's a question you have about being an RPG creator, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments below so I can address it in a future episode. If you want to help me keep the lights on and keep this show going, then please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and giving it a share on your own social media pages to help boost the signal. Lastly, if you really enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a tip by buying me a Ko-fi or becoming a Patreon patron at the links in the video description below. You'll find me on both sites under the name The Literary Mercenary.